we've got the number down by 85%. But is 140 plus deaths a year in the workplace acceptable to us, or do we need to do more?
Hello, I'm Terry Griffin, litigation partner at Napperton Solicitors. You're listening to the Brief Conversations podcast. Today we're talking about health and safety, and I'm joined by Chris Walker of ATG, Health and Safety Consultant. Good morning.
Hi Terry.
So what are the benefits of a positive health and safety environment?
We're looking at the ability for an organisation to avoid prosecutions, avoid the wrath of enforcing agencies for breaches of health and safety legislation, which could have significant financial impacts for them. We're looking at reducing the costs of absence from the workplace. Those injured or who become ill within the workplace are likely to require time off, which results in loss of productivity. There's the disruption to the workplace that's caused by poor health and safety management, where it results in an incident without an effective health and safety management system, without a positive health and safety environment within the workplace. There is a strong possibility that employees will become disengaged with their employers, harder to retain, and it'll be harder to recruit employees into that environment.
These prosecutions are also matters for the public record, and a company is likely to be hit reputationally, and that can impact on the short term and also in the long term should the company try to grow. So with the introduction of the new sentencing guidelines, I think there's been a massive sea change with how the HSE view potential prosecutions, and also the potential outcomes for companies who fall foul to those prosecutions. Giving an example, I was actually involved on the periphery of one of the leading HS prosecutions, the Alton Towers matter, involving the Smiler ride. Significant injuries to the two females at the front of the ride, and their two companions were also injured, but not as significantly. I understand that the guidelines have completely shifted the landscape, and this company is a perfect example of how that has occurred.
Yeah, absolutely, sorry. I think the Merlin Group, who operate Alton Towers, certainly fell victim of the sentencing guidelines at the point they were introduced in 2016. When you look at an incident that occurred within another one of their entertainment locations at Warwick Castle 8 years prior to the Smiler incident, the group were prosecuted for failures in health and safety legislation, failures to meet their requirements under health and safety legislation, which led to the death of a visitor to the castle. So that brought a £350,000 fine for the organisation, which was, at the time of the prosecution in 2012, prior to the implementation of the sentencing guidelines, and Merlin Group was worth in excess of £350 million a year in turnover. So if we compare the Smiler incident that you referred to earlier to the Warwick Castle incident with the same Merlin Group, although the incident happened just before the implementation of the sentencing guidelines, the prosecution took place after they had been implemented. Based on all of the considerations in applying the sentencing guidelines, a fine of £7.5 million was imposed in this instance to the group, which still had a similar turnover to that which it had back in 2012. It was reduced based on their early guilty plea for the incident.
I think that really is a prime example as to how the levels of fines have increased from a few £100,000 for fatality all the way up to millions of pounds for a non-fatality, which leads me really to the guidelines themselves. They look very scary. How do the HSE go about applying these guidelines?
They're going to look first of all at your culpability, how much to blame you are, how blameworthy you are. They'll look at how severe that harm could have been, as well as how likely that harm was to be realised. They will combine those two factors and plot them ultimately against the turnover of the business to decide a proportionate fine that will have a significant financial impact with the ultimate desire really to be one that draws attention of the boardrooms of the United Kingdom, of shareholders in our companies, in order to understand how important health and safety legislation is.
In my dealings with the HSE, I've always found them to be very polite, very thorough, very pleasant to deal with. However, I would possibly describe them as having an iron fist within a velvet glove.
Dependent on the on the matter in hand, they are largely supportive. They're to help us understand our obligations as businesses and to guide us where we are falling short of those obligations. I think, as you rightly point out, that does not necessarily mean we're not going to get hit with a fine or a penalty just because the HSE have supported us and helped guide us. It is ultimately the responsibility of business to be aware of the regulation that applies to it and to comply with it.
And what is the success rate in prosecutions in your experience?
The HSE appear to rarely get it wrong when they go for a prosecution and are achieving a 95% success rate in prosecuting those who've breached health and safety legislation.
So are there any myths out there that you feel should be dispelled about this nanny culture and HSE gone mad?
It's very rarely a health and safety regulation that lies underneath the myth or the horror story that health and safety have stopped the fun happening. You've got to look at health and safety bans on graduates throwing their mortarboards above their heads, which was described as insane health and safety regulation gone mad. When ultimately you drill down into that story, the people hiring the hats out didn't want them getting damaged. That's what lies underneath that rule. It isn't a health and safety regulation.
So what would your recommendation be to companies in general when considering the health and safety procedures?
I would ask any business leader, site manager, operations director to look at their business, look at their operations, all aspects of it, and ask themselves, do they really understand what health and safety regulation applies in their scope of operations? What are the potential types of harm that could result from working in their operation? Who might they be harming as a result of the work that they're carrying out? And most importantly, what are they doing about it? What are their control systems? What measures do they have in place to ensure nobody gets harmed? And ultimately, they need to seek competent advice and guidance to assure them that they've got all of that in place.
Has the health and safety drive towards prosecution and education helped to drive down fatalities and accidents at work?
We're reducing the amount of people that we injure and we're reducing the amount of people that we kill at work. I think the latest figures suggest an 85% reduction since the early 80s on workplace fatalities, which is absolutely huge. But when you're faced with a question regularly, has health and safety gone too far? You have to ask yourself, yes, we've got the number down by 85%, but is 140 plus deaths a year in the workplace acceptable to us, or do we need to do more?
So given the nature of your work, your involvement with the HSE is pretty much pre-prosecution, isn't it? So do you have any insight or knowledge as to how vigorously or how they apply the sentencing guidelines?
The focus for me and my colleagues is definitely to avoid HSE interaction and attendance at our client sites. We openly communicate with them, as you say, pre-enforcement, in order to help them understand how our clients are managing health and safety.
Best advice would be, obviously, make sure that your health and safety procedures and policies are in place. Consult with people like yourself. It is vital that you look carefully at the HSE evidence and the way that they apply the guidelines, because I've yet to deal with a matter where we've not been able to reduce the blow that the HSE interpretation of the guidelines. We can shave tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pounds off their starting point.
We can see that there's been a real positive impact of the regulations that have been put into place over time on a health and safety basis. They've reduced the number of fatalities, reduced the amount of ill health and incidents in the workplace, and that work must continue.
Thanks for that, Chris. It's very informative. Please look out for the future podcasts, which will be with you soon.